privilege to stand up here today to introduce this distinctive panel of experts. Dr. Catry is a structural engineer with 39 years experience in structural design, construction, and project management. He is a founding member of Catry International Incorporation and works nationally with HOA clients. Alan Vina is the Chief Operating Officer for PCW Contracting Services. He has 30 years hands-on experience in residential, commercial, and multifamily construction. He has extensive experience with structural restoration in the HOA arena. Michael Kennedy is a partner of Birding Wheel in the litigation department. Michael has been involved in residential and commercial construction litigation for over 25 years, dating back to his time during law school when he worked for a firm representing homeowners in the construction defect matters. So now, without further ado, let's give them a warm welcome.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I got to get situated. Thanks for joining us today. We are going to be talking about a very important topic that you've probably heard about before, but you're going to hear about some more. SB 326, new Civil Code Section 5551, and aging buildings and deferred maintenance. So with that, we already got such a great introduction. I think we can skip past this, but just so you put names with faces, I'm Mike Kennedy.
Dilip Khatri. Alan Vina.
And so just a quick introduction. You've probably all heard about this new law or been to lunch and learns or read articles about it. But the quick background is it's commonly called the balcony inspection law. It doesn't apply just to balconies. This was inspired by a tragedy in Berkeley where an apartment building had a balcony fall off, and 6 college students fell 2 stories to the ground and were killed. There are different inspection requirements for apartments and condominiums. Today we're talking about the condominium inspection requirement under the Davis-Sterling Act. There is a different inspection requirement in the Health and Safety Code for apartments, but we're not covering that today. There were some other incidents that also prompted this inspection requirement. These new inspection requirements typically follow incidents that you read about in the news. Expect something coming down the pike from the tragedy in Florida last year, Champlain Towers. Nothing's on the books yet, but that'll be the subject of future luncheon talks, I'm sure. So let's move into the meat of this. This is the building in Berkeley where the tragedy was suffered. You see these 2 balconies in the center. The upper one was cantilevered out with wooden joists. This building was only a few years old. I think it was 4 years old when this tragedy occurred. There was a party going on that night. This is a college apartment building near Cal Berkeley. There were 14 students on that balcony, I think, at the time, but that was well within the design live load criteria for that balcony. It should have been able to, we have a structural engineer to talk about it, but that balcony should have held 14 students easily. We see the next picture. The morning after the tragedy, you can see the pieces of the joists sticking out of the building. The waterproofing had been insufficiently integrated with the door pan at that door that opened out onto the balcony, and water was trapped between the top of the joist and the plywood on the underside of the balcony, trapping water in there and rotting the top of the joist, and the balcony fell off. So keeping in mind that this was a relatively new building, this was not a 50-year-old building with a bunch of deferred maintenance. This building was 4 years old at the time of this tragedy, and this is one of the incidents that resulted in this relatively new inspection requirement. These types of things happen on older projects as well. This is an association in Palo Alto that was about 40 years old. Luckily, nobody was hurt, but this balcony also collapsed off the building. This is more of a deferred maintenance situation. where the waterproofing had not been kept up, and this balcony also fell off this building. And then the last example is a stair landing that fell off. This, and we'll get into this a little bit further into the presentation, but this is called the balcony inspection requirement commonly, but it does not apply just to balconies. It applies to stair landings, elevated walkways, anything with a walking surface more than 6 feet off the ground if it's depends on wood or wood structure for any part of its structural support. So, let's see if the video works for this. Dylan, did you? The sound doesn't work. But Dylan, I think you had something to say about this tragedy in Malibu that happened recently.
Yeah, so Malibu, as you can see in the video here, that was quite tragic. That there's a lot of balconies that are in this condition. These are older buildings. This probably built back in the 60s, and it has the effect of salt water environment, which corrodes the wood. And unfortunately, this happened in the middle of a party. And there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of houses in this condition. The SB 326 does not apply to residential homes at the moment, single unit dwelling units. As far as I know, they haven't included that. But clearly there's a need. And the point here, as you can see from the video, is it was pretty tragic. I don't think anybody died from this, but again, not a good situation, and it emphasizes the value of this law to prevent this from happening.
Yeah, so the point of these is not to show sort of a parade of horror shows of building failures, but these types of tragedies or building failures occur at newer buildings, older buildings, single-family homes, multifamily homes. And so the inspections are expensive, and boards are going to resist, and probably already are resisting these because of the cost of these inspections, but they're important because newer buildings have problems because of construction defects. Older buildings have problems because of deferred maintenance. And so as a result, we have these inspection requirements for certain types of buildings. Let's move past the Malibu balcony collapse. So here's an example of an older type of building that you may have noticed, on property walks and so forth, that a building looks like this may need pressure washing or painting or some sort of deferred maintenance. But keep in mind, when we look at the outside of a balcony, the stucco, the paint, the efflorescence washing off, you're looking at essentially the skin, and the new inspection requirement requires an inspection of the bones, not just the skin. So we may look at that and think that that needs to be pressure washed or painted. But the inspection requirement actually goes much deeper than that. The other part, interestingly, is in the picture on the left, that particular balcony may not be subject to the inspection requirement. We'll get into the details a couple slides down the road, but the inspection requirement is the exterior elevated elements, that's the balconies, the walkways, the stair landings, if they extend from the exterior wall of the building. So if you think of, and it's very common here in Orange County, the type of balcony that's mostly over the garage, like the one in the left photo here, or completely over the garage, that would not be subject to this inspection requirement. It's a good idea to inspect it and maintain it anyway, but this one would not be subject to the inspection requirement. The ones where it sticks out a little bit over the edge of the garage, we have an association where they stick out like a foot, and the balcony goes, 15 feet back to the sliding glass door into the living room. That part is subject to the inspection requirement, and the inspection requirement requires inspection of not just the part that sticks out, but the associated waterproofing systems, the membrane, the edge metal. So you got to go back over the part that's over the garage. But we get a lot of questions about what's subject to the inspection requirement and what's not on some of these unusual types of balconies that the legislature didn't think of when they were writing the law. That is something to be aware of. Sometimes you may say, I'm doing all the talking here. Yeah. Sorry. That's what I do. And again, some things may seem cosmetically like they need to be painted, repaired, not that serious, but this is another type of a location that allows water into the building assembly below. We see this very commonly in our SB 800 cases, is you see building features that are very commonly sources of water into the building, and this post down into the balcony is a textbook example. If that square tube post isn't sealed perfectly into the surface of the deck, that's a source of water to get down past the water-moved membrane into the section, or into the assembly. So the inspection says it's the balconies, the walkways, the joists and the structural framing, but you also have to have the inspection conducted of the sources of water into the building. So that's why it's also the associated railings, edge metal, et cetera. It's not just from below. And here's a prime example. Alan, you've probably seen this in repairs and so forth. This is actually from destructive testing from an SB 800 case. This is the same location. The picture on the left is the balcony before anything's been done. It looks fine. Concrete isn't damaged by water, but keep in mind that's just the skin. The inspection requires inspecting the bones, and the location on the right is the same location after the concrete's been cut away, and we see damage to the wood framing.
Yeah, so typically in most associations, everybody likes to make sure everything looks pretty, kind of paint over it, and hey, out of sight, out of mind. But this is a perfect example of, it looks like the repair looks good, everything on the left looks great, until you peel that layer off and then you start finding that the structural components are actually damaged. This becomes a bigger problem when you don't have the deferred maintenance. But these are the kind of things that are brought up for this bill and for the inspections, and the importance of, even if it looks good on the surface, you don't really know until you actually get in there and see what's going on. There's obviously a bunch of ways you could do that without having to tear off the whole deck from the top, and I'm sure we'll get into that in a minute. But yeah, this is, and I see it all the time. It's not only just the deck to wall or the deck transition, it's also the rail penetrations to the wall or the actual framed wall there that probably allowed that damage to happen.
Yeah, and this is why it has to be an invasive test. It's not just a visual inspection of the balconies. The statute has the word visual in it, but it's a visual inspection of the structure, not a visual inspection of the outside. And these pictures are a perfect example of why. So, what has to be inspected? Philip, you're the inspector.
Yes. So the way the law reads is elevated elements, which we call balconies, but that includes stairways, anything that's elevated. The legal text is anything that's 30 inches or higher, or 6 feet or higher is considered an elevated deck. There's a little bit of a disconnect there because the building code classifies an elevated deck as 30 inches or higher. So the law says 6 feet, but the code says 30 inches. So in our practice, we will apply what the code says to avoid any gray areas, but it's 6 feet as far as the text goes. And we have to perform a visual inspection. We will normally use some instruments, a laser survey, a borescope, which are non-invasive as far as a phase 1 inspection, and then if we find problems, then we will ask for a phase 2 to do a secondary inspection. I'll give you the short version of the causations of these. It really boils down to 2 major factors: water and termites. Everything is linked to those 2. Water, from poor drainage, lack of waterproofing. We don't get a lot of rainfall as other states do, but still it leads to dry rot, it leads to termite infestation, and that's what you saw in the previous slides. And so at the end of the day, what SB 326 is really saying is they're looking to have the balconies, the elevated exterior elements investigated for life safety. And the inspector, which per the law is either a structural engineer or an architect, has to sign off and take responsibility for that project.
And keep in mind, it's exterior elevated elements that depend structurally in whole or in part on wood or wood-based products. So that naturally takes high-rises out of it, right? Because high-rises have to be steel or concrete balconies because of the fire code issues. And they have to extend from the exterior wall of the building. Well, that seems easy if we picture all these balconies sticking out, but there are a lot of weird in-between wobblers that we've all gotten questions from managers and boards, like the kind that only sticks out a little bit and most of it's back over the garage. Or the kind where the exterior wall of the building looks like it goes out and around all these patios because of the big stucco face like these lecterns, but the wall's actually back there, even though if you're standing out in the parking lot, it looks like the wall zigzags. Structurally, the wall of the building is back there where the shear paneling is, so those extend from the exterior wall of the building. Or I've got one now where we cut open the balconies and the cantilevers sticking out are steel, but the support across is all wood. And the statute says if it depends in whole or in part on wood or wood-based products. So there's going to be some judgment calls about which buildings are subject to the inspection. And keep in mind, it's residential buildings, 3 units or more, so it's not the community room building or any other buildings in the project. And it's not PUDs, it's only going to be condominiums. And it's only exterior elevated elements for which the association has a maintenance or repair responsibility. So a lot of you have associations where the governing documents say the homeowner has to maintain, but the association has to repair, right? Well, it's maintenance or repair. And some boards will say, well, I know what we'll do is we'll just transfer the maintenance and repair responsibility back to the members and the unit owners, and then we can dodge the whole thing. And that would work, but is a terrible idea because you know your membership. Half those people are going to do it themselves on a Saturday morning with their brother-in-law and a case of beer. And it's going to be raining balconies. So that's not a good solution. And it's the associated membranes. So it's not just visual of the balcony, and you will get proposals that say, the law says it's visual only. I can walk around, have our guy walk around and look at them, and that's a visual inspection, and that's way cheaper, and you don't have to cut into them. That's not true. So you don't want the super cheap inspection and have the city come back in 10 years and say, nice try, but the inspection you did didn't count, and now you got to start all over again, and you're not funded for that, right? So it's visual of the structure itself. You got to look at the skin, at the bones, not the skin. And it's the associated waterproofing, so you got to look at the stuff on top, right? Alan, you've probably been hired to cut through the concrete to look at the membrane above. What's that process look like?
Correct. But there's also a couple things that you mentioned, like with a concrete deck. Some of the buildings have, maybe 3-4 stories. First floor will be a podium deck over parking. It's not completely out of that situation, only because you're still looking at the lateral walls. So if you have a stucco wall on top of a concrete podium deck, that's still subject to being inspected as well for the live load on the lateral. And back to the whole, what constitutes as something that falls under this. I think the best way I heard it put was, if you could stand under it and it's sticking out of the building, it's subject to be inspected. I mean, I just kind of puts it a little bit clearer and then layman's term, instead of trying to read through this bill and see if whether or not it applies to your association.
Yeah, that's the easiest test, is can it fall off while you or your board president are standing on it?
Correct. And,
if yes, inspect it.
Well, yes, anytime you cut into even a deck with concrete over plywood, it's not just cutting that section off. I mean, us as a contractor, we cut it out for an engineer to go look at. We still have to come back, patch that back, and do the full system over it until we get the plans back, until we get a directive on what the repair is.
let's see. Like we kind of already covered this. It doesn't cover concrete and steel balconies, which is going to be all of your high rises. It only covers components intended for human occupancy. That seems obvious, but the weird wobblers are, what if you have a bunch of decorative Juliet balconies and they're not designed for human occupancy? How do I know if it's designed for human occupancy or not? Well, that's a term of art for a designer, so I'd ask you rather than making the call myself.
So, you know, from the inspector's point of view, as an engineer, as a structural engineer, if I'm signing for this project, anything that a person can go climb out on is a potential life safety threat. Even though it may be a Juliet balcony with a window, if they can get out onto that structure, it may not technically, legally be, quote, under the law, but it's a potential lawsuit for me. And so I'm going to include it in my inspection. And I'll make that clear, because we've had projects where these, quote, balconies were not under the law, and I'll issue an exemption letter. That exemption letter still carries liability from my firm because I've told them that, okay, you don't have to worry about it. So before I issue that, we'll still ask to inspect the railing, because if they can come out there and fall off of it, even though it's not technically under the law, I'm still going to get in trouble for it. So as a matter of practice, this is just a policy with my firm that we will take a look at it. We will ask that it be tested, evaluated. And so we do go a little bit outside of the envelope of what the SB 326 for the safety of the HOA and for ourselves too, and for the general contractor. Because if I issue an exemption letter, I'm still taking responsibility that I've exempted that balcony or elevated element. And before I'm going to do that, I'm very careful about issuing any report or exemption letter, because I know that it's going to be in their file for 18 years.
And Dill makes an excellent point that we don't have a slide on, but I don't care, I got to say it anyway because it's such an important point. It's critical for the manager and the board to keep in mind who has what responsibility under this inspection requirement. So the bill says the board has to have the inspection done, not the association, the board. What's the distinction? Well, what if your board decides they can't afford it? Our reserves are too low, we want to do a special assessment, we'll just hope the city forgets about us and never comes after us. And now it's 10 years later, and the balconies are twice as rotten, and the future board says, where's that previous board? If they would have caught this back in 2022, we wouldn't have to rebuild all the balconies because the damage wouldn't have been as bad. Those 2022 board members violated the Davis-Sterling Act. It's their responsibility, even if they're gone and off the board. And I don't think you're protected by the business judgment rule if you ignore the civil code. There's already a case that says you're not protected if you ignore the governing documents. And so that's the distinction, is the 2022 board or 2023 or 2024 has to have the inspection done. And if they don't, they're not off the hook. It's their responsibility, and the future board or future association can come back and say, if you would have done your job, we wouldn't be looking at this bill. Now, it says the inspector decides what to look at and how many to look at. I heard one of my competitors present one time and say the association should have a statistician to help understand how many balconies to look at, because the statute says you have to be 95% sure. He has to be 95% sure that what he saw is representative of the whole, and so the board should hire a statistician. No. That's not the board's call. And anytime the association or the board take on a new responsibility, that's new liability they didn't have before if they make a bad call. So he gets to decide what he has to look at to be 95% sure, and the association and the board should not step in and take over that responsibility. And then lastly, it says, once the inspector makes their recommendations, the association has to follow those recommendations, not the board, the association, which means if a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, they haven't done it, it's not the past board, it's the association still has to go do those repairs. But what does that mean, you have to be 95% sure?
So the law was written with the intent to try to minimize the cost of this inspection process. So the way the law is written, it says a sample size to justify a 95% confidence level on behalf of the inspector. So let's take an example. You have a project, you have 100 balconies. According to the law, as the inspector, as the structural engineer, under the law, I could inspect 5 of them, issue a letter and say I'm 95% confident, and charge you for only 5 inspections. The law allows me to do that, but I'm not going to do that because I'm not going to risk my whole existence on inspecting only 5 balconies when there's 95 balconies out there which potentially could fail. So we have the legal requirement which allows the inspector, yes, it allows the inspection company, the registered professional, who's going to sign and take responsibility for your project on his or her license with his or her insurance. So that's what the law says. Now, as a policy in my firm, if you're dealing with me, we do 100% of the inspection, just as a policy. And we discount the rate as much as we can. And the reason that I do that is that my opinion, and it's strictly my opinion, it's not the state's opinion, is that I don't think that you can justify 95% confidence level by doing a percentage inspection because balconies are very individualistic. There's people with balconies that don't use them, and then you have balconies that are semi-arboretums, and you have Grandma Jones, who has the flora and fauna from the country of Panama hanging on her balcony, and then you have the unemployed son-in-law or whatever who's sleeping on the balcony. So this issue of taking a sample size, it's not potatoes that are coming from a plant where all the potatoes are coming from the same plant. They're highly individualistic. So I refuse, again, in my practice, that we will do 100% inspection, period. And if the client doesn't want to do that, that's okay. We're not forcing you to sign with us. But I want you to understand as a customer that if something does happen, it only takes one balcony to fail. We have a saying in the engineering business: we're 2 failures away from being shut down. It only takes one, and everything just goes to hell, okay? So I'm not taking that chance with my license, so that's my policy. But the law, the way the law is written, and you will find firms that'll do that, and that's fine. But I'm just speaking for my own firm, that we have a different standard. It's a higher standard, which I think is the right standard for your safety. But the law allows you to take like a 15% or 10% sample size and justify. But then that firm has to sign and be responsible for it. And remember, the other thing is that my report is going to be there, or the inspector's report is going to be there for 18 years.
Yeah.
Which I'll still be here, but maybe others won't. I don't know.
Yeah, but let the inspector decide that, because they all have different opinions. 100% sample size is probably the safest. I co-presented on this at another presentation a couple of years ago. We had a statistician talk about this. That was the part where everybody went to sleep. No offense to any statisticians in the room. So we don't have a statistician today. But he made the point that the larger the project, the smaller the sample size, right? If you have 4 balconies, you probably got to look at least 3. If you have 400 balconies, you don't have to look at 300 of them, And also it depends on how the project is situated. Are they all the same? Are they different? Do you have 3rd floor balconies that shelter the 2nd floor balconies? But the inspector makes that call, not the manager, not the board, because that's just extra potential liability. And I think we covered it doesn't apply to plan developments. Anybody gets an extra cookie if they can raise their hand and say why? Okay, I got all your extra cookies. 3 units per building, so it doesn't apply to duplexes, doesn't apply to planned developments. If the association has a maintenance responsibility and there's 3 units in the building, then the exterior elevated elements have to be inspected. What else goes in your report?
So we will do an inspection that will cover the SB 326 basics, as I call it. We go beyond that. We will also look at the balcony in terms of railing heights, the openings in the railings, because it's a safety issue. That's not required under SB 326, but we put it in our inspection report. We look at the waterproofing. And the reason we do that is, again, it's the liability issue. That if a balcony is going to fail, if I'm signing off and giving you a green ticket on your balcony, that's a lot of responsibility for me as a firm. So we will do more than just what's required in our report. The basics of the SB 326 is to determine safety. Is that balcony, that stairway, is it safe for occupancy, or is it a danger? And if it is a danger, then we have to issue a recommendation to repair. The timelines are very clear in the law. The timelines are that when I finish the inspection, if any balconies are red tagged in our report, quote, unsafe, I have to report that to the building official within 15 days. I have to send my report to the building official. And then if they need to be repaired, replaced, whatever, the work has to be done within 180 days of the inspection. Just a side note, there are some balconies that I had to send, and I don't send the report right away. I inform my board or the client that we're going to have to send this to the city of whatever. Most of the cities, when we deliver the report, they don't even know about the law. So, we give them this, and they say, "What do you want us to do with this?" And we say, "I don't know. Just take the report." Okay. We don't instigate any inspections. We don't call the police or anything like that. We just do what the law requires us to do so that they can't come back and say to us. So we have to report to the city. As far as the 180-day rule, it's written in the law. I have projects right now that are past 2 years. They haven't been repaired yet. So they're not necessarily enforcing it, but it does depend on the city.
Yeah, I think it's going to be, most of the cities don't have any idea about this yet, but they'll figure it out. But they'll figure it out at different rates. And I think it's going to be very similar to like the seismic retrofit statute in San Francisco and some other cities, where all these old buildings with the soft story, carports underneath, they had to put cross bracing in for earthquake safety. And they all had to do that by a certain date. And a very small percentage of the buildings actually did that. And the city started doing enforcement. And if you wrote to the city and said, we're in the middle of it, or we've done the inspection and we're raising the money and we're working on it, they left you alone because they're focusing on the people who had done zero. And I kind of expect the same thing depending on the cities with this inspection, right? If you say, well, we're in the middle of conducting a vote to have a special assessment to fund it, or we're in the middle of an SB 800 case, or we're in the middle of the inspections right now, but we have 600 units. As long as you're doing something, probably, don't come back and, if the city does something different, it's not my fault. But that's probably not going to get as aggressive as enforcement as the associations that have done 3 years after the deadline, right? Because it is a huge project and it's going to be a very expensive inspection. And keep in mind that this is incorporated into the reserve study. That's the whole point of this thing, is Civil Code 5550, the reserve study update inspection requirement, has already said you have to do a reasonably competent and diligent inspection every 3 years of everything the association has to maintain, right, to update the reserve study. That's been in the books for years. And the Bureau of Real Estate has published guidelines for about 15 years saying you should have a contractor or other business partner assist with that inspection so it's a competent inspection of what they really know they're looking at. And that's expensive, and almost nobody actually did that. So now it's a deeper dive, every third reserve study update, and that's why it's every 9 years. Look, I blundered into a transition right to the next slide. So it's every 9 years because it's every third reserve study update. This is part of the reserve study update process. So that's why it's got to be every 9 years. And the first building's after the first 6 years, because if there's a problem with the walkways and the balconies on a 40-year-old building, that's because of a lack of maintenance probably, and everybody kind of should have had on their radar that we should have been fixing these this whole time, but we didn't want to raise our dues. But if you have a problem on a newer building, that's a construction defect. Keep in mind the tragedy in Berkeley where the balcony fell off. That building was 4 years old, I think. That's not deferred maintenance. And so that's why the first inspection is after only 6 years, and then every 9 years after that to diagnose these problems before the damage gets too severe. And as Dilip mentioned, the report is an association record for 2 inspection cycles, so for 18 years. So keep in mind what happens when a unit sells. The association provides the association records to the member, and that member who's selling their unit gives it to the potential buyer. Now, if I'm a potential buyer and I get this scary report that says all the balconies are rotten, I want a discount on the price. That affects the property values. And so for the next 18 years, all the sellers are saying, oh, I know this report's scary, but we repaired it years ago, I swear. Well, I got this scary report and I want a discount on my purchase price. And so you got an effect on the property values for 18 years, even after you fixed it. How do we get around that? Well, I think that to do this full inspection of 100% of the balconies, or however many balconies, so the inspector is 95% sure, and they write the report, and they stamp the report, and they put it in the association records, you got to do all that by January 1st, 2025. There's all these great reasons to do the report early. One of the reasons is we don't have to do the full official report right now. Let's look at 2 or 3 balconies, 5 balconies, depending on how big the project is. Let's have a draft report. If we were doing the official inspection right now, what would that report say? But we're only looking at 2 or 3 balconies to see what condition it's in. And depending on your circumstances, if the project's newer or there's a potential claim against a homeowner for causing damage, maybe it's an executive session topic, and then it's all run by the association's council to look at a draft report of a few of the balconies. It's not our official SB 326 inspection yet, and let's see what we're going to find. And if we're going to find problems, we got a couple of years. Let's go do all the repairs now, and then do the report after the repairs. Have the inspector follow the contractor around, right? You're going to have a designer anyway. He's going to need to do plans so that he can rebuild all those balconies, have him follow them around and document the condition during the repairs, and then the report's going to say everything's fine because we just fixed it all. And now you got a clean report for the next 18 years, and you've preserved the property values.
I'll add just one statistic, if I may, to the conversation, that the state of California is the largest population of HOAs in the country. The last I checked, it was 50,000 HOAs in the state of California. And I'm pretty sure they all have at least 10 balconies. We could make that a relative.
It's solid average, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, at least, I would guess. So the total volume of balconies is somewhere between 500,000, could be over 1 million balconies, right? And they all need to be done by this date. So don't wait, okay, please. because I've turned in proposals like in the last 2 years, and then, I mean, that's fine. They're sitting on it and taking their time. But, you know, if you're going to call me on December 15th of 2024, I may not be home. So, you know, just,
Yeah.
or I may not answer. I'll transfer it to Alan.
Neither one of those guys are going to be answering the phone in November and December of 2024 because everybody else is going to wait till the inspections. I'll still answer because I'm here for you, but they're busy. So do it now because the good inspectors and the good contractors are going to be solidly booked doing these inspections because everybody else procrastinated. So the earlier the better. The other reason to do them now is the new Fannie and Freddie lending requirements for those prospective purchasers ask, when's the last time the project was inspected by an engineer or an architect? Well, if you haven't done your balcony inspections and you haven't been through an SB 800 process, it's probably never been inspected by an architect. Why would you pay an architect to come look around unless you're doing these inspections? So most of the associations probably never been inspected by an architect. But if you do these early, now those lending disclosures can say, oh, we had an architect look at it in the summer of 2022 and we did our SB 326 inspection report and we did the repairs first, and so here's our clean report. And now you got good answers for those requirements, and you got a clean report, and the property values are happy, and everybody's happy, and you won't have an angry mob at the next board meeting. So, Dilip, say you're too busy and you can't answer the phone. Who can do the inspections if we can't get a hold of you?
Oh, no, I'll be available.
Well, I think before you call, Dillip or anybody else, you can use your contractor. Most of us provide, free inspections. At least this way you could identify those life safety issues. You could identify the components that stick out and start repairing those prior to calling in that engineer or architect. Save your guys a little bit of money. Obviously, those things get repaired and get documented and permitted, so that way you have a record of it. But at least that way you also have kind of a prototype of what you're getting into cost-wise. Especially if you have one of those balconies that is already falling apart, you see it, or like Dillip said, it's an arboretum, full of plants and it's overloaded, or pets. We've seen those where people leave their pets out there and let them go to the bathroom on the decks. They're not meant to withstand that. So that's a good point to just get in there, get your contractors out, help you guys out prior to bringing in the engineer, and then we partner up together to make sure that the inspections are set up prior to that.
On a serious note, as far as timeline goes, what we're doing right now, we're into the cycle right now. I think we're over 1,000 balconies finished. We're somewhere in between 1,000 and 2,000 right now in terms of our overall project depth, and we have pending balcony inspections. So what we do is we'll just tell you, schedule you out for the next 3, 4, 5 months or whatever, and tell you honestly when we can get to them. Because we're doing 100%, to do 150 balconies, that can't be done in 1 week. So it's not unusual for us to have a 2 to 3 month timeline, because it's not just when we can come there, it's when that unit owner is going to let us in to get into the balcony. So there's logistical issues there. But we'll give you a timeline, and hopefully you can live with our timeline. If not, then you may have to get another person. Just make sure that whoever you hire, contractor or engineer, whoever you choose to retain, make sure they have the general liability insurance, professional E&O insurance that includes multifamily and condominium projects, because a lot of firms don't do that, and they won't be able to give you a proposal. So just make sure that endorsement, whoever you want to hire, anybody, just make sure that they have the insurance to cover your job.
Yeah, exactly. The regulars are regulars for a reason. So your brother-in-law that has a Class B license and wants to expand his business might be your favorite relative at the holidays, but they got to have the right insurance. They got to have the right experience. Working on an inhabited in-service residential building should be a subspecialty license, I think, but it's not. It's just a regular Class B license. But the contractors that do this every day have a different varied experience than a regular contractor that builds, a new building from scratch, and dealing with the people that live there, getting access to all that. These are going to be just like the inspections we do in our SB 800 cases all the time. And I will tell you that getting access is a really hard part. You can't just say, okay, we're going to knock on 100 doors and 100 people are going to let us in and we're going to cut open their balcony. No. One of them just had a new baby, and the other one works from home on Zoom, and the other one has their elderly parents staying with them, and the other one has a COVID outbreak in the house, and the other one, you got to come back next week, and the other one, access is pretty complicated and pretty tough, and getting into all those and cutting open all those balconies is not something that the residents are excited about. So let's see. We talked a little bit about what the expert determines, but Dilip, do you have anything else to address about what your report encompasses?
So you'll get a report, if you retain us, you'll get a report from us which will give a grade rating to each balcony. It's green, yellow, or red. It's a very simple scale of 1 to 10. If the balcony rates between 1 and 5, it's a green tag, which means you don't have to do anything. If it's a yellow, it'll be a 6, 7, or 8. And yellow is kind of on the fence. We're kind of letting you decide. And if it's red, we're advising you to do a phase 2. And then after the end of phase 2, then we will determine what's green and what's yellow or what's red, and then the red ones need to be addressed. You do get from us an individual report on each balcony, which is very important. So we give you an Excel sheet, and one balcony could have 10 sheets to it. So our reports are pretty substantial. We did a 100 balcony project approximately, and I think our report was like 800 pages when you look at all the balconies. So because we give you an individual report, because the person who owns unit number, 97 and is tagged red, says, well, why am I tagged red? I want to know what this guy did. So they can go to that, and you can slice out that individual report, and then that person can see, you've got a palm tree on your balcony, and you've got a little pool going on up there, or whatever the situation is. So we do give them a full report. I'll just add one quick note on the issue of the jurisdiction. When you've been in the business as long as I have, and I've worked with practically every jurisdiction, at least in Southern California and also up north, I have learned that cities, like people, have personalities. And so there are some cities that are, kind of mean, and then there are some cities that don't know what's going on. So I'll just share with you 2 cities that are not in Orange County, but Santa Monica, tough place to work in, tough, very diligent, and City of LA, very diligent, very tough. City of Long Beach, Of course, everyone in Orange County is very sweet, so. I'll leave it at that.
So now that you've heard us talking about how we have to rip 100% of all the balconies apart and rip all the stucco off and all the concrete off, not really. The statute says you can use the least intrusive method available. It says you can use borescopes and infrared cameras and moisture meters. So a moisture meter, I have one in the car, and I always forget to bring it in, is 2 probes that you jab into the wood, and it measures the electrical conductivity between the probes, and you figure out how much moisture is in the framing member. You have to cut open the stucco to get to it, but that tells you the moisture level of the lumber. It should be, 10 to 14%, and if it's 30%, that means that it's going to rot and the balcony is going to fall off pretty soon. A borescope is basically just a camera on the end of a wire, so you can drill holes in the stucco and stick it in without cutting open the whole, soffit of the balcony or walkway. But keep in mind, it can only look in that area. So if this is the underside of a balcony and the big structural members are running this way, and you have other structural members running this way, you might have to cut multiple holes to look in every joist bay to look around, because Alan, you were talking about how different parts of the balcony might have different responses to the water.
Correct. So most people want to, especially an engineer, they're going to go, like he said, drill a hole, put a borescope up there. You're going to see one joist bay. Hopefully that's the joist bay that you see. It looks good or it's bad. But typically most of these damages are going to be next to a scupper, next to a drain on that deck. But not always. Like the Berkeley collapse, that came from the sill pan underneath the slider, which is all the way at the back. So if you're only inspecting the front of your joists and you have blocking in between there, you don't see the back, then you don't have 100% guarantee that deck is correct or is sound. That's where the inspection vents that you see on the screen there become a useful tool in 2 ways. One, makes it easy for the engineers to be able to go look at all the joist bays at one point at one time. And 2, allows your deck to actually ventilate and not trap moisture. So it acts as a double purpose for you. So that's another way that you could get ahead of this by installing these on your balconies now and get ready for your inspection from your engineer or architect. It's just a little bit, just thinking ahead and getting ahead of the, everybody calling on December 15th, 2024. So that makes it a little easier for you guys and your board. The other way that they do it, I've seen the plugs, guys do the plugs, or an architect or engineer will do a hole and they just put a PVC plug. Well, when they have to inspect that again in 6 years and again in 9 years, they'll have to put another hole. So eventually you end up making Swiss cheese underneath these lids, and you have all these PVC plugs, and that doesn't look pretty. So these are just thoughts and options you can give your board.
Now, the statute also says you can use an infrared camera, and you might get proposals from inspectors that say, oh, these guys are crazy. We don't have to cut in all the balconies. We'll just walk around with an infrared camera. And the code section says you can. But an infrared camera tells you if there's a temperature differential in there, which indicates whether there's moisture in there. It doesn't tell you whether there's rot. It tells you if one part of the assembly is colder or hotter than another part of the assembly, which doesn't help you assess the structural members themselves.
Yeah, the only comment I would add to that, that's all correct. The thermal camera will at least help us to determine if there is actual possible leakage occurring, which could lead, I mean, it gives a very high likelihood that it could lead to potential damage, but it's not going to confirm it. The only way to do that is to cut it open.
Exactly.
But it's another tool to add to the list, and we use it.
It can help you zero in an areas because you can find water but no rot, which is a problem. But you could have rot and no water.
Right.
And so you can't, you can, but we recommend not relying exclusively on that. This is a little bit more about the strip vents, Alan. Why don't you talk about that process and putting those in and so forth?
So for this slide, you see it all the way back towards the main building. And that's because it's a radius deck, so it's usually, that makes sense on that. Other decks that are kind of levered, you want it, like I said, right underneath the location of where the scupper drain is, which would be at the front of that deck, and you put that strip there for the engineers to do their investigation later. And like I mentioned, it adds its two purpose, not only for the inspection, but also ventilates your deck so you don't have that trapping moisture and, worried about what's happening underneath there. So in this case, like the Berkeley collapse, that's why they put this one here. Makes sense because that was right underneath the sill. But with putting it up towards the front, you get to see the whole joist member, and you also get to see with the borescope, you go all the way back to the attachment point to the building.
Okay. We talk a lot. We're entering the lightning round now, guys. We've talked a little bit about who does what. Keep in mind, contractor is the one that cuts in and provides access for this, but isn't the one that writes the report. Structural engineer or the architect writes the report and potentially reports issues to the city if there are any life safety issues, right? Then, again, the who does what, who has what responsibility part, he provides his report to the association, and if there's not a life safety issue, he's done now, and now the association takes that report and has to follow his repair recommendations. And so if they don't, and now it's 10 years later and it's going to cost twice as much, somebody's going to be unhappy about their special assessment and say, why didn't you fix this a long time ago when the damage wasn't as bad or before I bought my unit? And so that association follows the responsibility follows the association around for a little bit. The other potential liabilities, if the association doesn't follow his recommendations, is personal injury claim. God forbid, a balcony falls off the building and somebody gets hurt or killed. Remember the one in Berkeley that started all this? 6 college students were killed. I don't know what the going rate for a wrongful death claim is, but it's a lot more than whatever the insurance the association has probably. It's also may set a standard of care for what's a safe functional component. It may affect those of us in handling our SB 800 cases and the type of testing we do in that case. That 95% certainty standard applies for the reserve study update inspection. It has not yet been extended to what we do in our SB 800 cases, but it might and may require us to do a little bit more testing down the road in those types of cases. That's something that we're looking at internally, but you don't all need to worry about right now. We talked about the reasons not to wait, and even if your associations want to wait for a couple of years, at least start saving right now. The inspection cost itself can be a reserve study line item, and use reserve contributions to save up for these inspections because they're going to be expensive. What else? The inspection report, as we talked about, becomes an association record. The association doesn't owe a duty to prospective purchasers, but they have to provide the association records to the members, and the prospective purchaser is going to ask the seller for a copy of all that stuff. So it's going to fall into the purchaser's hands, and that's going to affect property values for the associations. It's going to be potential breach of fiduciary duty claims against directors who blow off this inspection requirement. And I think, again, under that Palm Springs Villas versus Parth case that says you do not get the protection of the business judgment rule if you ignore the governing documents, would probably get extended to ignoring the civil code as well. And so the directors have to do what they have to do, whether it's required by the by the civil code of the governing documents, and so they can't just ignore this, even though it's going to be a nuisance and pretty expensive. And in a construction defect claim, there are only 5 defenses to an SB 800 case, and there are only a couple of them that are realistic. You didn't follow the maintenance requirements, and being the most common one. And not following this inspection requirement and having the damage get a lot worse than it would have otherwise been is, I think, going to be used as a potential defense once the builder's attorneys figure this out. How much is this going to cost?
So,
You like that?
I don't know if I should quote my prices, but I'll tell you the range. How about that? I'll give you a range. So for us, for the inspection costs, we're somewhere between $200 and $400 per balcony. That's kind of our range. We're never over 500. We go as low as 200 on the really large jobs. You know, if it's 100 balconies, or I think it's around, once we cross a certain threshold, like if it's over 50, you know, that's our cost for a phase 1 inspection. I have no problem sharing that with you. I mean, it's, you know, you can ask other firms what they're charging, but that's what we charge, and we give a pretty detailed product for our services. And then there would be a second charge, about the same for a phase 2, but then in phase 2, there would be an additional cost from contractors. So I'll let Alan address that.
Well, costs vary depending on your decks and the condition of the decks and the association and logistics. I mean, that goes to say with anything. If they're easily reached, then no problem. If I have to scaffold off the side of a hill, and that obviously the cost goes up. So most of the time, we partner up with an engineer, architect, and it's simple. We go out, we open up some areas, they do their investigation, come back with the report, recommended repairs, and if it's something really bad, then hey, if it needs shoring, we shore it right away. That's first, life safety items, and you take it from there. After that, it's dependent on what his findings are that determine how much more has to be taken out or apart, or if it's a complete rebuild, or if it's just the edge and the flashing and the scuppers or something like that. Might be just the plywood and a couple of the joists. It's not all of them. So it all depends. It's dependent on the conditions of the deck.
And so have him or your favorite contractor come give an estimate first. I mean, some of them might be really easy if it's open deck boards and you can walk around underneath and see the underside of the deck boards, and they can drive lifts around or climb up on a ladder and look at it and don't have to cut anything. That's easy. But if it's concrete on top and stucco on the bottom and up against a hillside and you can't get in there with a lift, and it's, there's a 4th story, those are going to be expensive. But figure that out ahead of time and do it now so that they have an accurate number to put in the reserves. Even if your boards want to save up for a couple of years, figure out what you're saving up for first, right? So get the estimate now, even if it's going to be a couple of years before you do the inspections. We've talked about this. The inspections as well as the repair are reserve line items. How long the inspections are going to take depends on how big the project is and how complicated it is going to be. There's going to be extra work for the manager. So don't forget your bill for time and make sure the board's ready for that. These are extra tasks that are probably on top of your standard management contract. The attorneys have a role too, I think, guiding the boards to make sure they do the right thing, making sure they don't take on too much responsibility they don't have under the statute. I think that initial dip your toe in the water where we look at 2 or 3 of the balconies can be an attorney-client privilege report, because there is a potential claim by whoever caused the damage. If the building's under 10 years old, call your friendly neighborhood construction defect attorney, and maybe the builder gets to pay for all the inspections and the repairs. And then I think we're very close to being out of time, so there's pictures of all of us in case you've blocked out the image of our live faces.
That was taken a few years ago. I got to get a new photo.
Yeah.
My college graduation.
Right? We always try to leave time for Q&A. We're never successful. I don't know if you're set up for that, but come find any of us or call us or email us if you have any more questions. And that's our show.